The saloon stank of things dying. Spilled whiskey, old sweat, and the rain-soaked dust that clung to everything. The floorboards groaned under the weight of too many men who had forgotten their own names, their laughter loud but empty. Outside, the sky cracked open with a roll of thunder, a warning that nobody inside was sober enough to hear. And on a makeshift stage of splintered crates, 3 girls stood. No one had asked them to climb up there. But when the man with the gold tooth pointed, they did it. Barefoot. Silent. They had learned a long time ago that silence was cheaper than pain. The eldest was 17. She held her chin high, a queen on a throne of garbage, even though her lip was split and bleeding from where a man's ring had caught her earlier. Her dark hair was a tangled mess down her back, wet from the storm. The sleeve of her simple dress was torn at the shoulder, showing a pale sliver of skin that made the men lean forward. The middle sister, 15, stood just a step behind her, her hand locked around the wrist of the youngest. That one was only 12. Too small for a place like this. Too small to understand the cold weight of what was about to happen. The crowd was a sea of muddy boots and slurred words, men in long dusters who smelled of the trail and bad intentions. Tankards slammed on sticky tables. Coins clinked, a greedy metallic sound. The lanterns threw flickering shadows on the walls, making the girls look like ghosts trapped in the wood grain. "She's a bit scrawny, that little one," a man slurred, pointing at the youngest with the toe of his boot. "But I reckon she'll fatten up on stew and chores." The eldest girl's eyes flashed. "She's a child." The words were sharp, and they cut through the noise for a second. Then the laughter came, roaring and ugly, a wave of it crashing over them. The saloon owner, a man with greasy sideburns and a belt made of silver bullets, held up his thick hands. "Easy now, boys. Let's not ruin the merchandise before the sale." He turned to the girls, his smile a sick, sweet thing. "See, these little darlings were left to me. A debt. Their daddy owed me for a month of horses, and then he decided to gamble with his liver instead of his brains." "Didn't he die right out in the street?" someone called from the back. The saloon keeper grinned, a real showman now. "Face first in horse piss, and he took my money with him, but lucky for me, he had collateral." The crowd murmured, some of them clapped. A few looked away, ashamed, but not enough to stop it. The eldest girl's voice was shaking, but she forced it out anyway. "We are not cattle." The saloon owner just smirked. "No, sweetheart, cattle are worth more." The middle sister flinched like she'd been struck, pulling the youngest even closer. The 12-year-old hadn't said a word all night. Her eyes, wide and dark, just darted from one leering face to the next, a deer cornered by wolves. A hush started to fall, not out of respect, it was anticipation. The bidding was about to start. That part always quieted the room, and that's when the door slammed open. It didn't just open, it exploded inward, the hinges screaming in protest. Rain and wind lashed into the room, and a figure stood there, silhouetted against the raging storm. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his coat soaked black. His hat was pulled low, hiding his face in shadow, but the silver on his gun belt glinted in the lantern light. Nobody moved. The saloon owner cleared his throat, his confidence faltering for just a second. "Evening, stranger. You here for whiskey or for company?" The figure didn't answer. He just stepped inside, his boots squelching on the wet floorboards. Water dripped from the brim of his hat. He scanned the room, his gaze slow, deliberate, unreadable. He took in every man, every half-drawn breath, every hand hovering near a gun. Then his eyes lifted to the platform. He looked at the 3 girls. They didn't speak. They barely breathed. But the middle one's grip on her sister's wrist tightened until her knuckles were white. "You bidding?" the saloon owner asked, forcing a laugh to break the tension. "Or you just here to watch the show?" The stranger moved to the center of the room. Without a word, he dropped a small leather pouch on the floor. It didn't thud. It clunked. Heavy. Silver coins spilled out, rolling across the warped wood, shining like fallen stars in the dirt. "You'll let them go," he said. His voice was low, but it carried across the silent room like the rumble of the thunder outside. It wasn't a request. The owner chuckled, but it was a dry, nervous sound. "Friend, I think you're confused. This here is a private transaction. These girls are already spoken for." The man didn't even blink. "By who?" A red-faced settler with a stained beard stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "By me, and two of my boys here." The stranger turned his head slowly, his face still hidden in shadow. "Then you'll unspeak it." The room went cold. The air got thick. The settler's hand twitched, reaching for the pistol on his belt. He wasn't fast enough. He wasn't even close. The stranger's revolver appeared in his hand like a magic trick, a whisper of steel. Suddenly, the settler's hand was empty, and his own gun was sliding across the floorboards. The hammer on the stranger's gun was cocked, the sound a final deadly click in the silence. But he hadn't fired. The threat was enough. It hollowed out the room, sucking all the air out. "You gonna shoot a man over a few brats?" another man asked, his voice shaky. "I'll shoot over the principal," the stranger said, his voice as flat and hard as the land outside. "And the principle is simple. A man doesn't sell girls, not on my watch." The saloon keeper tried to laugh again, but it cracked in his throat. "This ain't your watch, stranger." The stranger finally turned. His eyes, for the first time, met the eldest sister's. They were gray, like a storm-swept sky. "You got names?" he asked her. She hesitated, her defiance warring with her fear. "Not ones you'll buy." A flicker of something crossed his face. It might have been a smile. "Good," he said. "I'm not buying." There was something in his voice, something like old gravel worn smooth by time, that settled the tremble in her hands. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. "This here's illegal," the saloon keeper barked, his face turning red. "They're in my care. Their daddy's signature is right there in my ledger." The stranger walked slowly toward the bar. He glanced at the open ledger, then reached inside his coat. For a second, a wave of panic washed over the room. Was he reaching for another gun? Instead, he pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This one's from the circuit judge down in Dry Wells," he said, his voice calm. "He heard rumors about this place, about what you do here. This says I have the authority to investigate and to remove anyone being held against their will." The saloon keeper snatched the paper. He read it, his eyes darting back and forth. He swore under his breath. "You forged this!" The stranger just shrugged. "You could try telling the judge that, or the marshal, if you'd rather wait for him to get here." The mood in the room shifted again. Men who had been leaning forward, eager for a show, now started backing away toward the door. One of them tipped his hat to the girls as he left. Another muttered something that sounded like an apology. The saloon owner's bluster was gone, deflated like a cheap balloon. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had nothing left to say. "Get off the crate," the stranger said, looking back at the sisters. The middle one moved first, pulling the youngest with her. The eldest hesitated for a moment, her eyes locked on the stranger. "What do you want from us?" she asked, her voice low and suspicious. He replied without a single beat of hesitation. "Nothing." She narrowed her eyes. "Then why?" He looked past her for a second, his gaze distant, as if he was seeing something no one else could. "Because someone should have done it a long time ago." They stepped down from the platform. As they passed the saloon keeper, the eldest girl, the one with the split lip and the fiery eyes, turned and spat on the floor near his boots. The stranger led them out. He held the swinging doors open with one hand, the other resting near the pistol on his hip. The rain poured down, washing the dust and grime from their faces. The youngest girl looked up at him, her small face streaked with rain. "What's your name?" she whispered. He didn't answer. He just led them through the thick mud, past the stables, toward a lone horse waiting patiently in the downpour. The wind howled, and behind them, the saloon was suddenly quiet, a box of yellow light filled with cowards and shadows. Beyond the town there was nothing but hills and silence, but for the first time in a very long time, the three girls weren't walking into it alone. But then the youngest sister stumbled. She let out a small cry of pain. The stranger stopped immediately, turning to her. Her bare foot was bleeding, cut by a piece of broken glass hidden in the mud. He didn't say a word. He just knelt down, his movements slow and deliberate, and gently lifted her into his arms. She was so light, she was nothing. He settled her on the horse's back, in front of him, and wrapped a corner of his soaked duster around her small, shivering body. The other two sisters just watched, their faces unreadable in the dark. He had faced down a room full of armed men. He had bluffed a greedy saloon owner with a piece of paper. But this small act of kindness was somehow more shocking than any of it. It was a language they no longer understood, and it scared them more than any threat. The horse carried no saddle, just a worn wool blanket and a simple leather bridle. The man had no saddlebags, no supplies, nothing but the clothes on his back and the gun on his hip. He rode west, a shadow moving against a bruised, dark horizon. The two older girls followed on foot, silent as ghosts. The rain had stopped, but the air was still heavy and cold. They walked for what felt like hours, the only sound the soft plodding of the horse's hooves in the mud. They crested a low hill, and the land opened up before them, wide and empty and waiting. The road was barely a road at all, just two ruts cutting through the tall grass, leading to nothing they could see. "Where are we going?" the middle sister finally whispered, her voice hoarse. The man didn't turn around. "Home." "Yours?" she asked. He just nodded once. The eldest sister, Lacey, suddenly stepped forward, planting herself in the path of the horse. She put herself directly between the man and her sisters, a small, fierce wall of defiance. "And if that's not all right with us?" The man pulled the horse to a gentle stop. He dismounted, moving with a quiet grace that was surprising for a man his size. He faced her, and in the pale moonlight, she could finally see his face clearly. It was a hard face, weathered by sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that weren't from smiling. "You're free," he said, his tone perfectly level. "You can walk anywhere you like, but the next town is 6 days from here, on foot. And your sister," he motioned gently to the youngest, who was now asleep against his chest on the horse, "won't make it halfway without food or a roof. You stay with me, I'll feed you, I'll keep you safe, that's all." Lacey's eyes didn't soften. "And you expect us to believe you're some kind of saint?" "No," he said, his voice rough. "I expect you to believe I'm tired of digging graves." They didn't ask any more questions after that. They just followed. The house appeared near midnight, a dark shape tucked into a slope of rock and dry pine. It was a modest ranch, with a narrow porch that sagged like it was tired of holding itself up. The windows were dark eyes staring out into the night. No light but the stars. Inside, the air was stale, smelling of cold ash and old bread. A kettle sat on the hearth, long since cooled. A single wool blanket was folded neatly on a wooden bench. There was no sign of a woman's touch, no curtains, no flowers, no softness. There was only one photograph in the entire place, a faded tintype on the mantelpiece. It was a man in a soldier's uniform, standing stiff and proud. Beside him was a woman, her hand resting on his chest. She was laughing, her head tilted back, and she was heavily pregnant. The girls hovered in the doorway, not wanting to step inside. The man lit a lantern, and the small room filled with a warm, flickering light. He gestured to a corner near the fireplace. "You can sleep there. The floor's clean." "What about you?" the middle one asked, her voice barely a whisper. He sat down on a stool near the door, leaning his back against the wall. He unbuckled his gun belt and laid it carefully on the floor beside him. "I'll be right here." They didn't trust him, not for a second. But there was something about the way he sat there, arms folded, head tilted back, like a man who hadn't truly rested in years. They believed in that moment that he wouldn't harm them, at least not that night. Lacey lay awake for hours, her eyes open, staring at the rough-hewn timbers of the ceiling. The youngest, Mercy, curled up against her, her breathing soft and even. The middle sister, Nell, stayed close to the dying embers in the hearth, her eyes flicking back and forth between the man at the door and the deep shadows that danced in the corners of the room. At some point, exhaustion finally took them. When they woke, the sun was just beginning to stream through the dirty windows, and the man was gone. Panic flared, hot and sharp. Had he left them? Was this some kind of trap? The lantern was still burning low on the table. The gun belt was still on the floor. But he was gone. Lacey's heart pounded in her chest. She grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, her knuckles white. Nell huddled in the corner with Mercy, trying to shush her frightened whimpers. They waited. The silence stretched. And then the door creaked open. He was back. He was carrying a small tin of milk and half a loaf of dry bread. He didn't seem to notice the poker in Lacey's hand or the fear in their eyes. "Eat," he said simply, and placed the food on the table. They ate. They were cautious, watching him with every bite, but they were starving. As they ate, he went to the windows and opened the old wooden shutters. Golden light flooded the room, quiet and peaceful. Beyond the house, a field stretched out, dotted with stubborn patches of green. To one side stood a barn, but it was slouching, more collapsed than standing, its roof pocked with holes like open mouths. "You live here alone?" Lacey asked, the poker still resting loosely in her hand. He nodded, not looking at her. "Why?" she pressed. He didn't answer. He just went outside and started working on a broken section of fence, the rhythmic sound of his hammer echoing in the quiet morning. The day passed in a strange, thick silence. The girls stayed near the house, washing their faces in a bucket of cold water from the well, waiting. They were waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the kindness to curdle into something else. That evening, Nell approached him as he was sharpening an axe. She had been holding on to her question since the saloon. "Did you really have a paper from the judge?" He didn't stop his work. He just kept pulling the file across the steel, a sharp, scraping sound. After a long moment, he said, "No." Nell stared at him. "You lied." He finally looked up at her, his gray eyes unreadable. "Would you rather I hadn't?" She had no answer to that. She just turned and walked away, her shoulders slumped. Later, little Mercy found a single chicken egg in the tall grass behind the house. She carried it inside like it was a diamond, her face glowing with pride. The man took it from her gently and boiled it in a small pot over the fire. When it was done, he peeled it and handed it to her. She broke it in half and offered a piece to him. He looked at the small, offered piece of egg, and for the first time, a real smile touched his lips. It was a small, sad, rusty thing, but it was a smile. He shook his head. "You eat it." That night, after the two younger girls were asleep, Lacey found herself sitting across the fire from him. The wind whispered through the cracks in the walls. "You keep looking at that photograph," she said. It wasn't a question. He didn't deny it. "Was that your wife?" He nodded once. "What happened to her?" "Pregnancy fever," he said, his voice flat. "Took her and the child both." The fire crackled, filling the silence. After a long time, Lacey said softly, "I'm sorry." He didn't look at her. "You look like her, when you're mad." She stiffened. She didn't know if it was a compliment or a threat. "I'm not staying here to fill some ghost's shoes," she said, her voice hard. "I know." She stood up to go, to return to the pallet on the floor. But before she could take a step, he spoke again, his voice so quiet she almost didn't hear it. "You don't owe me a thing. Not gratitude, not trust, nothing. I just want you to rest a while, until you can stand on your own 2 feet again." She turned back, looking at him, this quiet, broken man who had saved them. "What's your name?" He hesitated. "Dane." She nodded once. "Mine's Lacey, not Brat, in case you were wondering." "I figured," he said, and turned his gaze back to the fire. He thought she had gone. But a moment later, he felt a light touch on his shoulder. He looked up. She had taken the single folded blanket from the bench and draped it over him. She didn't say a word. She just went back to her spot on the floor and lay down. He sat there for a long time, the rough wool of the blanket a strange, unfamiliar weight. And for the first time in 5 years, Dane Callahan didn't feel completely alone in his own house. It began with small things. A spoon left by the wash basin, a shawl folded and placed on the porch rail before the wind could steal it, a bowl of beans set at his place at the table, even when he hadn't asked for it. These weren't acts of gratitude. They were acts of settling in. A slow, cautious shifting of weight in a house that had only held one heartbeat for far too long. Dane noticed the change in the silence first. It wasn't the absence of noise anymore. It was the absence of fear. For days the girls had moved like startled deer, their ears sharp, their eyes wide. Now Nell hummed to herself as she shelled peas on the porch steps. Mercy had started talking in her sleep, soft, jumbled words about bread and a woman named Ruth. Even Lacey, who still watched Dane with an intensity that could cut glass, no longer flinched when he walked past her. He hadn't meant to care. He hadn't planned on it. His life was a carefully constructed fortress of grief and solitude. But something in him was starting to bend. He had gone years without company, years where the only voices in the house were the echoes in his own head. His days had been shaped by the simple, hard logic of fence posts and livestock, of weather reports he muttered to himself, and letters he wrote to his dead wife that he never sent. He had forgotten what a shared meal sounded like. He'd forgotten what it felt like for a house to hold other people's breath. They had arrived like stray seeds on the wind, and damn it all, they were starting to grow roots in his rocky soil. One morning, he was up on the barn roof, patching the holes. He heard laughter. He froze, hammer in midair. It was a sound so foreign in this place that for a second he thought he'd imagined it. It came again, clear and full. He climbed down the rickety ladder and saw Mercy chasing one of the wild chickens around the yard, her arms flapping, her face alight with pure joy. Nell was leaning against the porch rail, laughing so hard she had to hold her sides. Dane just watched, hidden in the shadow of the barn. He let the sound wash over him, letting it settle in his chest like a long overdue rain. Lacey was standing nearby, her arms crossed, her face a mask of neutrality. But her eyes were on her sister's, and there was a softness in them he'd never seen before. "It's not a pet," she said, noticing him. Her voice was flat. "I told her. It'll run off, and she'll be disappointed." She's had worse disappointments, Dane said quietly. Lacey nodded once, her gaze still on Mercy. Haven't we all? She added, almost to herself. That night she found him outside by the well, oiling the rusty hinges on the gate. The moon was a heavy silver coin in the sky. "My name's Lacey," she said, as if they were meeting for the first time. "I figure you ought to know it." Dane just grunted, not looking up. "The middle one's Nell, and the little one is Mercy." "Fitting," he said. "Is it?" He didn't answer, just kept working the oil into the old iron. But something about the way he stood had shifted. He seemed less hunched over. Lacey lingered. "You never did say why you brought us here." He stopped his work. He set the oil can down and stared out into the darkness. "I don't know. That's not the truth." He let out a long, slow breath. "Maybe not. Maybe I saw something that shouldn't be happening, and for once, I couldn't just walk away." "Is that it?" she pressed. "No," he admitted, his voice rough. "Maybe I was just tired of pretending this house was still a home when it was just a damn tomb." Lacey was silent for a long moment. Then, so softly he could barely hear it, she asked, "You think we make it one?" He finally turned and looked at her. In the moonlight, her eyes seemed to hold all the sorrows of the world. "I think you already have," he said. The days that followed found a new rhythm. Dane started teaching Nell how to set rabbit traps. She had quick fingers and a quicker mind. Mercy took to following him around like a stray puppy, her head full of questions about everything from fence wire to the names of the stars. Lacey kept her distance, but not as much. She started tending the small, neglected garden behind the house, pulling weeds with a quiet fury, muttering to herself as if she were arguing with the earth itself. It was Lacey who found the letter. It was in a small tin box hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the barn. She wasn't snooping. She was looking for a spare bucket when the board gave way slightly, revealing the box. She shouldn't have opened it, but she did. Inside there was only one thing: an envelope with a frayed corner. On it, in a delicate, fading hand, were the words, "To my Dane, if I go before the sun returns." She didn't read it. She couldn't. She just held it in her hands, the old paper feeling fragile as a dead leaf. She put it back, replaced the floorboard, and never said a word. But when Dane saw her later, her eyes were different. Less fire, more shadow. That night she moved her sleeping pallet from the hearth. She placed it near the door, right between Dane and the dark, windy night. He noticed. He didn't say anything. The next morning, a rider appeared on the ridge. A stranger on a dun mare, wearing a long coat, with a smile that was too wide and didn't reach his eyes. He dismounted slowly, letting the dust settle around him. "You, Dane," he called out. Dane stepped onto the porch, his rifle held loosely in one hand. "Depends who's asking." "Name's Cutter. I knew their daddy. Played cards with him a time or two down in Dry Wells." Dane didn't move. "What do you want?" "Well," Cutter said, his eyes scanning the ranch, lingering on the house. "I heard a tale about 3 girls who went missing from the saloon. Heard a rumor they ended up here. Figured someone might pay real handsome to get 'em back, or pay someone to hurt the man who took 'em." Inside the house, Mercy peeked through a crack in the curtains. Lacey moved behind her, silent as a breath. Dane's voice didn't rise. It didn't even change. "They're not going anywhere." Cutter laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Didn't figure you'd be reasonable." He swung himself back onto his horse. "But you should know, mister. There are other men riding this way. Men who aim to collect what they think is theirs. They got paper that says those girls are property. You best be ready." He turned his horse and rode off, slow and easy, showing them he wasn't afraid. Dane watched him disappear over the ridge. Then he turned and saw Lacey standing in the doorway behind him, her face pale. "They'll come, won't they?" she said. "Yes." She looked out at the empty horizon, at the endless, unforgiving land. "Then we better be ready," she said. And for the first time she didn't say, "you." She said, "we." That night they didn't sleep. They dragged the heavy wooden table to barricade the door. They boarded up the windows. Dane cleaned his rifle and his pistol, laying out the ammunition on a blanket. Nell watched him, her eyes wide. "Teach me," she said. Not a request, a demand. So he did. He showed her how to load, how to aim, how to squeeze the trigger without flinching. Her hands were steady. Mercy sat on the floor, counting the bullets, her small face serious. Lacey stood in the open doorway, staring out into the darkness. "You didn't want this fight," she said. "No," Dane replied, his voice low. "But I won't run from it." She nodded. Then she turned to him, her face unreadable in the flickering lantern light. "You're not the man I thought you were." "Disappointed?" "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm worried what I'll become if I start believing men like you still exist." He had no answer for that. He just picked up the rifle and checked the sights again. From her corner on the floor, Mercy suddenly spoke, her small voice cutting through the tension. "Are we staying?" Dane looked at her. At her round, serious face, still faintly bruised from that night in the saloon. At the way she sat up straight, unafraid. He looked at Nell, her hands stained with gun oil. He looked at Lacey, standing guard at the door. "Yes," he said. Lacey watched him, a strange look on her face. "Then maybe it's time we stopped preparing to leave," she said. She walked over to a small, dusty trunk in the corner, a trunk that had belonged to his wife. She opened it, and for the first time since they had arrived, she began to unpack. The dust appeared first, a thin, angry column rising over the ridge, drifting like smoke from a fresh wound. Dane saw it just after dawn. He was stacking firewood, and he paused, straightening up slowly, his eyes squinting against the rising sun. He didn't flinch. He just said quietly, "They're coming." Lacey was right behind him, her hands still damp from the morning dishes. She didn't ask who. She knew. Inside the small house, Nell took the rifle Dane had taught her to use. She moved with a calm, deliberate purpose that made her seem years older than 15. Mercy stood in the center of the room, her small fists clenched at her sides. She wasn't crying. She looked like a small stone statue of defiance. By noon, 4 riders crested the hill. They moved slowly, confidently. One wore a red bandana over the lower half of his face. Another had a sheriff's star pinned crookedly to his vest, a cheap piece of tin glinting in the sun. And at the center of the group rode a broad-shouldered man with a tangled gray beard and a nasty scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He rode with a slight, unmistakable limp. Lacey saw him, and a sound of pure hatred escaped her throat. She spat in the dirt. "Our uncle," she hissed. "That bastard used to beat our mama. Said she was excess weight." Dane just nodded once, his jaw tight as a drum. "You don't have to face him." "I plan on doing a lot more than facing him," she said, and went back inside. The riders stopped just outside the flimsy fence line. They dismounted, the dust swirling around their boots. They didn't call out. They just stood there, sizing up the quiet house, the ramshackle barn, the thin ribbon of smoke curling from the chimney. Finally, Dane stepped off the porch, the rifle held loosely across his shoulders. His voice was low and steady. "You're lost." The man with the limp, the uncle, let out a short, ugly chuckle. "No, but I'd say you're about to be. You've got no claim here, stranger." He took off his hat, revealing a face that looked like a crumpled piece of leather. "That right? See, These girls, they belong to kin. I'm their blood." From the darkened doorway of the house, Lacey's voice rang out, sharp and clear. "You're filth, and blood doesn't mean a damn thing when you let your own starve." Her uncle glanced at her, no shame in his eyes, only a cold sort of amusement. "You always did have a mouth too big for your own good." Dane took a step forward, placing himself between the man and the house. "You call yourself family, yet you were going to sell them to the first drunk with a coin in his pocket. You think that still counts?" The man with the crooked star stepped forward, his voice slick with false authority. "We've come for what's owed. The law's on our side. We got the paperwork." Dane's eyes narrowed on the crooked badge. "That tin star don't shine so bright out here, and it's not gonna save you." The uncle nodded once, his little show of negotiation over. "All right then, we'll do this the hard way. We take the girls, or we take this patch of dirt from your corpse. Either way, this ends today." Dane didn't move. "Not today," he said softly. Then he turned his back on them and walked slowly toward the porch. The men chuckled, mistaking his calm for surrender. But then they heard the sound of the front door opening again, and what they saw stopped their laughter cold. Lacey stepped out first. She had a rifle slung over her back, and there was a fire in her eyes that could have burned down the whole damn prairie. Nell followed, her own rifle held at the ready, her hands no longer stained with oil, but with grim purpose. And then came Mercy. She walked beside her sisters, her small face set like stone. In her hand she held a simple slingshot, a smooth, heavy rock already nestled in the leather pouch. The sight of them, 3 girls standing there, unafraid and armed, completely stunned the men. The uncle spat on the ground. "You trained 'em? You really that lonely, old man?" "No," Dane said, stepping up onto the porch to stand with them. "I'm just surrounded by women who've got more grit in them than you'll ever have." The shooting started before anyone really meant it to. The man with the fake star twitched first, his hand dropping to his gun. But he was slow. Dane's rifle cracked once, the sound echoing off the hills. The man dropped where he stood, the tin badge catching the sunlight as his chest hit the dirt. The other 2 dove for cover behind the fence line, bullets splintering the wood rails around them. Lacey crouched low, firing twice, the recoil barely moving her. Nell took aim, her teeth gritted so tight her jaw ached. The man with the limp, the uncle, tried to circle around towards the barn to get a better angle. But he didn't see the small figure hidden behind the water barrel. Mercy. She lifted her slingshot, pulled the band back to her cheek, and aimed without a tremor. The stone flew, a small, deadly missile. It hit the uncle square in the temple. He stumbled, stunned, his hand flying to his head. It was only for a second. But a second was all Dane needed. He was on him in 3 long strides. He didn't shoot. He swung the heavy rifle like a club. There was a sickening crack of bone. The man hit the ground with a groan, his blood soaking into the dry, thirsty dust. Silence fell again, sudden and complete. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the smell of gunpowder away. The last man, the one with the red bandana, crawled backward on his hands and knees, his face pale as a sheet. Dane walked toward him, his boots slow and heavy in the dirt. "You walk away now," he said, his voice a low thunder. "And you tell every man between here and that saloon that these girls aren't for sale. They're not yours. They're not anyone's. And if you come back here, you won't be crawling away next time." The man dropped his pistol. He nodded, his eyes wide with terror. He scrambled to his feet and half ran, half stumbled to the horses. Dane watched him go. Then he turned back to the others. Mercy was shaking now, the adrenaline fading. But she was still on her feet. Nell had a single tear, tracking a clean path through the grime on her cheek. Lacey lowered her rifle slowly, her breathing ragged. She looked at Dane, her face flushed, her eyes fierce. "They won't stop," she said. It wasn't a question. "They'll hesitate," he replied. "And then what?" "Then," Dane said, looking at the three of them, at this strange, broken, beautiful family he had found, or that had found him, "then we outlast them." That night nobody ate much, but they sat at the table together, their chairs pulled close, as if the violence had bound them tighter instead of tearing them apart. Afterward, Dane stood on the porch, watching the full moon rise, clean and white in the dark sky. Lacey came and stood beside him, her arms crossed over her chest. "You never asked for any of this," she said softly. "No," he admitted, "but maybe it's what I needed." She looked out over the quiet fields, silver in the moonlight. "They will come again. I know. What if they bring more men? What if they bring the real law?" He was silent for a moment. Then he turned to her. "Then I'll stand with you," he said. "Just like today." She looked up at him, searching his face for something. A lie, maybe. A weakness. But all she found was a quiet, unshakable steadiness. "You're not what I thought you were," she said. "Neither are you," he replied. They stood there in the comfortable silence, watching the wind move through the tall grass like a secret. Behind them, inside the small, scarred house, the girls were finally asleep, under a roof that was safe, in a home that was warm. And in that quiet moment, something shifted between Dane and Lacey. Not love, not yet, but something just as powerful. A pact, a promise made without words, a recognition that they were both just survivors, and that maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to survive alone anymore. The fire started just before dawn. Dane smelled it first, the sharp, bitter scent of smoke cutting through the cold morning air like a thrown knife. He was out of his chair by the door in an instant, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He was already halfway to the barn when he saw it. Flames. Angry orange tongues licking at the deep blue of the waking sky. The old dry timber of the barn caught fast. It went up like a torch. Within seconds, the roof groaned and then collapsed inward with a roar, sending a shower of sparks into the air. He turned and yelled, a raw, desperate sound. "Lacey!" She was already there. She burst through the front door of the house, her eyes wide with something beyond fear. It was fury. Nell was right behind her, dragging a half-asleep Mercy by the hand. Lacey didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just moved. She was already at the well, the bucket swinging, her hair coming undone from its braid, her skirts soaked with dew. She looked like a woman who had outrun so many disasters that one more just made her angry. "The back wall is gone," Dane yelled, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "Get the girls behind the house." "They did this," Lacey said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "They came back." He didn't have to ask who they were. He knew. They worked in a frantic, desperate rhythm, heaving buckets of water onto the scorched beams, trying to stop the wind from carrying the embers to the house. Dane's arms burned, blisters rising and breaking on his hands. The smoke clawed at his throat, making him cough until his lungs ached. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. This place wasn't just timber and soil anymore. It had become something else. A fragile, thin-boned hope that he had built, slowly and quietly, out of the ashes of his old life. By the time the sun finally crested the ridge, the barn was nothing but a blackened, smoking skeleton. The few animals they had were safe. The house was untouched. But everything else, the tools, the sacks of seed for planting, the small store of winter supplies, it was all gone. Just ash. Little Mercy cried when she saw that the old rope swing Dane had hung for her from a rafter was gone. Nell just stood there, her arms folded tightly, her jaw clenched, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Lacey didn't cry. She just stared at the smoking ruin as if it owed her a personal debt. "We should go after them," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "We don't know for sure who it was," Dane said, sinking onto the porch steps, his body screaming with exhaustion. "We do," she shot back. "And if we chase after every ghost in this territory," he said, his voice ragged, "we'll never have time to build anything worth keeping." She turned on him, her eyes blazing. "And if we don't, they'll just come back and burn the rest." He met her stare. She was right. He knew she was right. But he had lived long enough to know that fury burns out fast. It was what came after the fire that mattered. That evening, the wind shifted, and the air finally felt clean again. They ate dinner in near silence, just bread and salt and a few dried peaches. Dane chewed slowly, his gaze fixed on the fire in the hearth. He wasn't thinking about the burned-down barn anymore. He was thinking about names, the ones that had never been spoken in this house, but that somehow mattered more than anything. After the table was cleared, Lacey lingered behind. "Why did you never ask?" He looked up, confused. "Ask what?" "Our last name." "Didn't think it mattered," he said honestly. "It doesn't. Not out here." "Well," she said, and her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. "It matters to us." He just nodded. "It's Mathesy," she said. "Our mama's name was Mathesy, before she married a lifetime of trouble." Dane let the name hang in the air between them for a long moment. "Mine's Callahan," he said. Lacey let out a long, slow breath, a sound of release. "It fits," she said. That night, Dane didn't even try to sleep. He sat out on the porch, his rifle across his knees, and watched the shadows stretch and shrink as the moon climbed the sky. He had survived wars and fevers. He had lost a wife and a child. He had endured seasons that had broken better men than him. But nothing had ever rattled him like the thought of losing this small, scarred patch of dirt, this strange, fierce family of 3 girls who had been sold like cattle, but now moved through his house like it had been built just for them. In the morning, they went out to the ruin of the barn. They began to salvage what they could, digging through the ash and blackened timber. Mercy helped, her small hands blackened with soot. Nell found the twisted, melted head of a pitchfork and dug a small hole, burying it as if she were laying a person to rest. Lacey stood back, her arms crossed, until Dane found a large, smooth river stone. He handed it to her and nodded toward the small grave Nell had made. Lacey took the stone and placed it carefully on top of the fresh dirt. No words were needed. By noon, something in the air had changed. It wasn't safety. It wasn't peace. It was a decision. Lacey found Dane trying to straighten a bent fence post, his hands blistered and raw. "You could have left us," she said, her voice flat. "Back in the town. You should have." He didn't stop his work. Didn't want to. "Why?" she demanded, stepping closer. He finally stopped. He set the hammer down and looked at her. Really looked at her. "Because," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "you came here broken and brave. And every day you stay, you rebuild something inside this place, inside me, that I thought was burned to ash a long time ago." She stepped even closer, so close he could feel the warmth of her. She didn't break his gaze. "You want us to stay?" "I want you to choose to stay." She nodded once, a small, sharp movement. "I already did." The next Sunday, a traveling preacher happened down their trail. He had dusty boots, a crooked hat, and a Bible that was worn down to soft, supple leather. He didn't ask a lot of questions. He just raised a single eyebrow when Dane met him on the road and said, "We'd like to speak some vows." Lacey stood on the porch in a simple dress she had mended herself. Her hair was braided neatly with a piece of twine. She didn't carry flowers. She didn't smile. But when Dane took her hand in his, she gripped it like a drowning woman who had just found solid ground. "There's no ring," she said, her voice a low whisper. "Never needed one," he replied. "But you can carry my name if you want it. And if I don't, then stay anyway." She blinked, slow and deliberate, and he saw the firelight reflected in her eyes. "No," she whispered, "I'll take it." The preacher nodded, said the old familiar words, and pronounced them bound. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't rushed. It was something deeper, something steadier. It was a pact made in ash and sealed with stubbornness. Mercy clapped her small hands. Nell actually grinned. The sky behind them turned to gold as the sun began to set. That night Dane and Lacey stood side by side on the porch, their arms just barely brushing. Inside, the girls slept, the door bolted, the house warm and quiet. "Did you ever think it would come to this?" she asked. "No," he said honestly, "but I'm glad it did." And he meant it. Because sometimes the fire doesn't just burn things down. Sometimes it clears the way for something new to grow. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales from the shadows.